slavery, occupation, and colonial rule in between. All of this is explored in the new book called War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony. Joining me now to talk more about it is the author, who's also a former Manhattan Assemblyman, Nelson Dennis. Thank you for being here, and congratulations.
Oh, it's a pleasure to see you again, Harold.
Yes, absolutely. This book should have been written a long, long time ago. I'm glad you finally got around to doing it. And it explains. Well, first of all, let's catch everybody up with you. You ran a series of sort of insurgent candidacies against the Del Toros, and okay, right. The consequences were pretty tough. Let's talk about this chapter of American history that a lot of even New Yorkers don't know about. There was a period as late as the 1940s when it was literally illegal, like to get you thrown in prison if you even displayed the Puerto Rican flag. And this was the sort of the direct output or the direct result of colonialism shifting to something a little bit slightly less vicious, but there was always this fear of independence.
Well, the story of Puerto Rico and the story of Pedro Albizu Campos, the central figure in the book, they merge. And they actually merge in the title. The book is called War Against All Puerto Ricans because the police chief of Puerto Rico, E. Francis Riggs, whose father was the president of the Riggs National Bank, came down to militarize the police force shortly after Pedro Albizu Campos, who was I'm proud to say, a Harvard graduate, organized an island-wide agricultural strike, which triumphed. It doubled the wages from 75 cents to $1.50 a day. This was in 1934. Immediately, Wall Street reacted. They sent down a new governor, U.S. Army General Blanton Winship, and Riggs. They declared basically an all-out war, but they did it very explicitly. They started shooting nationalists in the street. And then Police Chief Riggs held a press conference to say that if Albizu Campos continued to, quote-unquote, agitate the sugarcane workers and the university students, there would be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans.
Against all Puerto Ricans, yeah.
Yeah, and the war continued because they weren't kidding. 2 years later, in 1937, they killed 17 men, women, and children in what became known as the Ponce Massacre, for much the same reason, because these people were supporting Albizu Campos. Albizu Campos spent 25 years in jail. He's basically the Nelson Mandela, the Simón Bolívar, the José Martí. In that conversation, Pedro Albizu Campos is right in that pantheon of patriotic heroes.
He's an extraordinary figure. I knew a little bit about him. I mean, we see these names on the side of a building, on the side of a school, or a street sign. But that he was the first Puerto Rican ever admitted to Harvard. He later becomes the valedictorian of the Harvard Law School class that he graduates from. Extraordinarily gifted, an orator, an organizer. You've got great pictures in the book of him out, sort of doing his thing. And he spends a lot of time in prison, but the movement really thrives. And I got to ask you, because it's not, it's sort of talked about in the book. The military governors, the police chiefs, the people who want to terrorize the nationalists, who threw him in prison and so forth, they always seem to be able to find soldiers and cops who are Puerto Ricans to sort of carry this out. What's the nature of those folks?
Well, and that's human nature, and it's the history of empire. It's not an unknown template. The question that you asked earlier factors into that. There was something called La Ley de la Mordaza, the law of the muzzle. It was Public Law 53, which made it a felony to utter a word, sing a song, whistle a tune, anything to do with independence, or any words uttered against the United States, or to own a Puerto Rican flag the size of this cup, the size of a postage stamp in your own home, which is a critical distinction, because that means they could break down your door. So under those conditions, essentially a thought police. This law, by the way, was promulgated in 1948, which is interesting, the year that George Orwell wrote and published 1984. So George Orwell was alive and well in Puerto Rico because under Public Law 53, you couldn't enunciate, there could be no public speech. In addition, the FBI maintained something called carpetas, which are secret FBI police dossiers on over 100,000 Puerto Ricans over a period of 6 decades. So you have this fabric of watchfulness, of surveillance. What we're concerned about as far as the WikiLeaks and the Patriot Act today, well, the template for that is very often set in places that we don't hear about. Puerto Rico, if I might say one thing, in Puerto Rico for at least 50 years, you know the term, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? What happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. And that's why this book connects a lot of dots. And we actually have to thank the FBI documents because they made it possible to reconstruct.
I was going to ask you about that. You actually have and reproduce a really important FBI document in particular that, you know, was a result of their surveillance of Luis Munoz Marin, who's the first elected governor. It turns out, and he had a very colorful history in the city that I knew nothing about, that he was hanging around in Greenwich Village, and he's smoking dope and all of this stuff. But the FBI gets wind of this, and they basically let him know that they know this, and you suggest that his statements show him going from being a nationalist in favor of Puerto Rican independence to opposing it at every turn, literally within days of getting this memo, and that this was something that J. Edgar Hoover held over his head.
Yeah, and you actually struck on a pivotal point here, and it's part of the philosophy of the book, because this is not a scandal mongering, and in Spanish we call it bochinche, a sort of like behind closed doors, you know, little gossip brag, right? This is just history, and it's a history that hasn't been properly developed and shared, and so this isn't so much to decry Governor Luis Munoz Marin as an opium addict, so much as to contextualize the fact that that was used by the United States as a way of controlling Puerto Rican politics, because there's a series of bills by Senator Millard Tillings, the chairman of the Committee on Insular Affairs in the Senate, who proposed a series of potential paths to independence. They were called the Tidings Bill. The Philippines actually availed itself of that expedient, although the terms are a little more favorable to the Philippines. They had a 20-year tariff rollback rather than about a 5 or 10 year. The point is that shortly, and as you said, within a matter of days of this document coming into existence, Luis Munoz Marin, who was elected on the terms of pan, tierra, libertad, bread, land, liberty, the liberty being independence.
Sure.
He did a volte-face, 180-degree turnaround, and he went up to Albany, shall I say. He went to Washington repeatedly on 3 separate cycles to specifically lobby and testify against the Tidings Bills for independence. And it was also he, when he was the president of the Senate, that passed Law 53 to basically abrogate the First Amendment rights of an entire island in order to shut one man up, Pedro Albizu Campos.
And you talk about Pedro Albizu Campos and his death, and you cite some convincing evidence that is not, you know, it's not airtight, but you seem convinced that he was part of a very shameful period in American history in which the government deliberately used radiation and gave cancer. I mean, you actually have some documents of people talking about specifically giving cancer to kill Puerto Rican nationalist prisoners. And you think that this might have extended to Albizu Campos.
And I devoted 3 chapters to it, and a lot of those chapters are actually footnotes, because we have to be careful to not venture into the realm of conjecture. There are hundreds of FBI documents, of those carpetas that were recently declassified, that I was able to connect the dots, and it became very clear that they basically put a moat around Albizu Campos so that doctors literally were not able to go in and physically diagnose him. The Cuban legislature enunciated a resolution with respect to this. Almost every major newspaper in South and Central America had articles about what was happening to Pedro Albizu Campos. A woman named Eileen Wellsom wrote a book called the Pulitzer, not the Pulitzer, they called the Plutonium Files, and she won the Pulitzer Prize for it. That book documented the fact that there were 16,000 cases, documented cases, of individuals and prisoners who were subjected to undisclosed radiation studies over a period of about 30 years. So this isn't any new ground. It's something, Albizu Campos was caught up in something that was happening, and unfortunately, he was really subjected to scientific savagery for his principles and his belief in independence.
Well, you've got tons of footnotes in here, all very well documented, and absolutely fascinating and essential tale. My understanding is you're going down to the island where it's getting quite a reception in the political class.
The Nationalist Party and El Independentista, the Independence Party, have embraced the book.
Okay, very good. Well, I embrace the book too. I urge you all to take a look. War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony. Nelson Antonio Denis. Good to see you.
Great to see
Don't
you.
be a stranger. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. We'll be right back in a minute. Stay with us.